So the next large land-based empire we're taking a look at is a true manifestation of Afro-Eurasia, because Russia straddles both of them. And in the meantime, we're going to take an inside look at a method of legitimacy known as absolutism. All right, absolute rule or absolutist rulers are going to be used to justify their right to remain in control. And this is a concept that is also known as the divine right. Now, the Russian and Slavic peoples were under direct control of the Mongols until about 1480. So the Khanate of the Golden Horde controls the Rus. Kiev had been the most important Russian city up to this point. But Moscow began to overtake it in importance because they were more consistent in paying their tribute. Ivan III is going to stop paying tribute in 1480, and about 20 years later, he will help overthrow the Khanate. Now, his son, Ivan IV, became Grand Prince of Moscow when he was 3. Now, his mother ruled for him until she was allegedly poisoned at age 8. Now, I understand that Russian cities were basically ruled by nobles known as the boyars. And Ivan spent years fending off the boyars and their attempts to claim his powers. And this is going to give Ivan a deep distrust of the boyars that would last his whole life. To demonstrate his show of power, he even fed one of them to his dogs. Now, Ivan was crowned Tsar, and we see it both ways. The way on the left emphasizes the fact that it comes from Caesar, and this shows Russia's links with Constantinople and thus the Roman Empire. Moscow was even referred to as the Third Rome. Now, his early years showed promise because he established a new law code and updated the military. He became paranoid when his wife died, and he used it as an excuse to torture and execute his enemies, hence Ivan the Terrible. And he would even do this within the Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Church served as a check on Russian leaders. Now, after the death of Ivan's son, the boyars wrestled for control of an emerging nation-state, and this was called the Time of Troubles, because there was no clear successor to the title of Tsar. The nobles offered the title to Michael Romanov. All right, Michael Romanov holds it, and it will be held by his family the next 300 years. All right, the next 300 years. Now, the major themes that we're going to see emerge during this time frame are the persistence of serfdom. Even after it's long been thrown by the wayside in Western Europe, the serfs will still be prominent in Russia. Due to geography, there's not much contact with the West, so Russia really is going to go their own way, and it's this combination of geographic isolation and Mongol control, and as opposed to Roman Catholic Christianity, the Russians are going to be Orthodox Christian, and this emphasizes their ties to Constantinople. Overall, Russia is very rich in, the following: agricultural lands, furs, and minerals, and it helps make Russia a great power by the 18th century. The profits of the fur trade were the chief incentive for Russian expansion. Now, a Russian family, a wealthy family known as the Stroganovs, led the way into expanding into Siberia, and they hired the trappers that paved the way into the east. Russian furs were highly sought after. That's why it's bolded here. And Western European traders would purchase them in exchange for new technologies. Now, the Russian incursions into Siberia will have a similar toll on native Siberians as Native Americans. And so you see these dependence on Russian goods, depletion of fur-bearing animal populations that has sustained native Siberians. The Russians didn't have competition, So they forced Siberians to provide furs instead of negotiating commercial agreements. And private hunters and trappers would compete directly with Siberians. When we say no competition, there's no European competition. The conquests will bring devastating epidemics, especially in the remote areas of Siberia. There was no built-in immunity to smallpox or measles. There was large-scale settlement of Russians in these new lands, where they outnumbered the native Siberian population. By 1720, about 700,000 Russians lived in Siberia, which meant that native Siberians only comprised about 30% of the populace. Many natives became Russified, meaning they adopted the Russian language and converted to Christianity. And conversion meant tax breaks, exempting them from paying tribute, or the yasak, and the promise of future land or cash. I mean, the Russians don't pursue conversion along the same lines as the Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, but nevertheless, it is something that is pursued. Now, with imperial expansion and more diverse peoples being incorporated into the empire, the Russians themselves became a smaller proportion of the overall population, and this empire was multi-ethnic, but the Russians remained politically dominant. And this concept of the identity crisis is something that's very unique. I mean, Russia straddles Christendom and Islam, and its population required a monarchy to hold it all together. You know, this often meant relying on the expertise of the Cossacks, who were independent warriors. You see the Cossacks here. They're known for horsemanship and loyalty. And so this extends to Russia itself. Are we Europe? Are we Asian? Or something else? As Russia expands, the concept of empire, it can be argued, remained until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. One historian wrote that the British had an empire. Russia was an empire. The fact that it's so deeply embedded helps explain its longevity. Now, when you talk expansion and legitimacy, administration, it begins with Peter the Great, who visited Western Europe when he was a young monarch, and he came to understand that Russia had fallen far behind the West in terms of technology and science. He wanted to transform Russia into a power that was comparable to the great Western powers. And he'll traditionally be seen dressed as a shipbuilder when he went to the Netherlands. The guy's 6'6". He's going to stand out. Everyone knew he was a royal, so he's a very interesting character. Now, he'll bring the church under control of the state to prove who's really in charge. And the Tsar will become more godlike. And the Orthodox Church had always kind of been the moral conscience of Russia, and they served as a check on the Tsar's power, but no more. All right, the church serves the state. He brings the boyars under direct control of the state and replaces the traditional boyar council of Moscow with a group of appointed advisors in St. Petersburg, and Peter himself appointed them. By providing government jobs to men from low-ranking families, Peter ensured their loyalty to him. And to further solidify his base, he abolishes hereditary positions and creates the table of ranks based on ability and standing. So he does solidify loyalty to him. Now, Russians traditionally are suspicious of foreigners, but Peter welcomes them with open arms, as long as they have a specific skill they can pass on to the Russian army and navy. Conscription is used to fill the ranks, and Peter opens up schools for arts and sciences. Now, he increases taxation to pay for these changes. He famously taxed all households, he taxed all men, and you can see from the image, he instituted a beard tax to get Russian men to shave them off, and if you refused to shave them, these nobles had to carry a tax, or they had to pay a tax and carry a metal card stating the beard is a superfluous burden. Now the nobles are required to wear Western dress, which isn't exactly practical for the cold Russian winters, and taxes will also increase on the serfs. Peter has no desire to make their lives better. Now in gaining warm water ports, Peter expands, and he spends most of his reign at war to get more territory. His earliest victory came against his mother, who was serving as regent and attempted to overthrow her son. Now, he had her placed in a convent and killed or exiles her followers, so that's that. The Great Northern War against Sweden was his longest, and these came with the heavy taxes and a toll placed on the peasants, who were forced to serve, and they were away for so long that their homes suffered. Nevertheless, he expanded Russia's holdings to include ports on the Black Sea that wouldn't freeze in winter. Now, he also builds a new capital called St. Petersburg, so he could be closer to Europe. And it was modeled along the lines of Rome and Vienna, whereas Moscow is more Asian-inspired. This means Russia is more powerful on both continents, and Russia, can kind of keep close tabs on what's happening in Europe. St. Petersburg is on the Baltic, so Russia at long last finally has an administrative port city. So Russia as a land-based empire amps up under Peter the Great in the first part of the 1700s. Catherine the Great continues it in the latter half. Now Catherine is German, and she converted to Orthodox Christianity at the time of her marriage. Now she actively learned the Russian language and wanted to understand the customs and traditions of who she ruled, unlike her husband Peter III, who didn't really care for Russian. Now in a few months, the royal guard helped her overthrow her husband and assume the throne. She's willing to do what it takes to gain power. We're looking ahead of it to the Enlightenment, but one of her goals was to bring the Enlightenment to Russia. And she continued the westernization begun under Peter, so she made a progressive law code. Catherine supported the publication of numerous books, including satires on the Russian court and nobility. She greatly supported the nobles and weakened the power of the serfs. That's one thing that we see. She definitely spread serfdom. All right, she supports the nobles so they understand who helped them remain in power. All right, she created primary and secondary schools, and they were supposed to be open and available to all. However, economics often kept poor children out of schools, and the divide between peasants and the nobility grew during Catherine's reign, because the peasants speak the Russian language, whereas the nobles spoke French, which is the language of the elite in Europe at the time. Now, the gentry gained much more control over their land and serfs, which led to numerous revolts. And she routinely gave away large tracts of land and also the serfs who lived there. So the number of serfs was continually increasing. A Cossack revolt, one of these internal rebellions in the mid-1770s, was brutally put down when the leader was dismembered and burned. She's not someone to mess around with. Whereas Peter was more land-based, under Catherine's reign, it did extend past the Bering Sea. So Catherine fought in 2 wars against Turkey. She added Ukraine, to parts of Russia, and gained part of Poland. By the time of her death, the Russian Empire extended from Poland in the west to Alaska in the east, and from the Bering Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This image is Alaska. It's the administrative center of Sitka, Alaska, which was considered Paris of the West. This place, which might seem desolate and distant, was a true cosmopolitan center built up during Catherine's time.